Hi, to be with you here. Yeah, welcome. All right, let's get going with those slides. All right, welcome to the Equity Advisory Group. It's February 21st. My name is Dr. Roberta Hunt, and I'm your facilitator for this group. Closed captions are in English and Spanish. English closed captions are available within Zoom and YouTube. Users can follow this link to view both English and Spanish captions in a separate browser window. So ibr.news/captions. So how to access closed captions in Zoom. At the bottom middle of your screen, you should see a menu of options. If you can't see the menu, hover your mouse over the bottom middle of the screen. Click on the CC icon and a separate window will appear. A separate window with captions will appear. All right. So please, we encourage EAG members to turn on your video. We love to see your faces. It is as close as we get. Please say your name when you begin to speak. And if you experience technical difficulties, please contact program staff at 360-329-6744. Okay, next slide. Public input instructions. There'll be an opportunity to provide public input later in the meeting today. So to submit input after the meeting, email comments to info@interstatebridge.org with EAG Public Comment in the subject line, or call 888-503-6735 and state EAG Public Comment in your message. So for today's agenda, we have our program administrator update. We will have an overview of the representative transit investments. We will look at technical analysis and equity benefits analysis and community engagement. We'll have some small group discussion, public comment, and close. Okay. So I'll turn it over to Greg Johnson, our program administrator, for program update.
Thank you, Dr. Hunt. Once again, for the record, my name is Greg Johnson. I am the IBR program administrator. And this is a very exciting time for the program. As you have seen over the last number of months, we have been steadily marching towards some decisions. We have been running analysis, both equity analysis as well as technical analysis on different design options. We use screening criteria that was created in part by the Equity Advisory Group to help screen items for equitable treatment. So we are in the process within the next month to month and a half of starting to roll some of these decisions out and put them in front of groups like the Equity Advisory Group for your input to make sure and to verify that we have followed some of the things that you have put on the table for us. So we know that one criteria cannot be the controlling option for everything, but we know that once again, we are centering equity, and equity is important to both of the communities as well as this region and the two DOTs who are the prime sponsors for this program. So this is something that we will be rolling out to you with some of the options and putting them on the table for your review. So tonight you're going to hear some of the issues regarding transit and equity in transit. So it's a presentation that has been being looked at by the partners. And so that presentation, I'm looking forward to hearing the response from this group. But once again, this is tremendously important work that's being done. We are potentially looking to have more than one meeting per month as we move forward, but that is still being talked about because once again, our timeline puts us in the middle of having to have some decisions made by the end of July by our bi-state legislative committee. So we want to make sure that everyone has had a chance to see everything, react to it, and we can take input and put it back into the program. And if you recall that spinning wheel diagram of input, analysis, and getting to more recommendations, that's what we will be doing over these next 3 to 4 months. So we are, right now, there's a conversation in Washington regarding funding that some of you may have heard. So we are not at the center of that discussion, but we know that that is going on and it is very critical to this program. If it does happen this year or if it happens in 2023, it is still something that is key critical for this program to have the endorsement of the state legislatures for the local funding piece for this program. So there's not a lot of new information. We have been tremendously busy running the analysis and running through the different scenarios. So I'm here to take questions that you may have for me, and we can go from there. So I will open it up, Dr. Hunt, for any questions that the EAG may have for me.
Questions? Well, I'm floored. So I am assuming that questions will percolate if you're available to stay for a little bit.
And I will be here for the majority of the meeting. So if questions do come up, I will be here to help answer.
Great. Thank you. All right. So let's go to the transit technical analysis overview, and Kelly Betteridge from the transit design team, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hunt. My name is Kelly Betteridge, and I'm a member of the transit team for IBR. And hopefully you're looking at a PowerPoint presentation. Just want to make sure. Perfect. Great. So tonight I have a quick presentation I'd like to provide to you just to sort of remind you where we have been in regard to the various transit investments that we have done some diving into, and to start to provide you some high-level takeaways about what we have gathered in terms of information about those potential investments. So I'll sort of go through 3 different pieces of the presentation. The first is just a reminder of the representative transit investments that we are looking at as a program. And we have 2 new ones that we haven't had a chance to show you before, so I'll touch on those briefly as well. Then I'll talk about the 16 measures that we have used, developed together as a team in order to understand how each of these investments sort of perform relative to each other. And then also provide a high-level overview of the things that have changed for transit since 2013 And 2013 is the year that the previous program, the Columbia River Crossing program, was put on hold. And then we'll also talk a little bit about our draft findings from those 16 measures, and then next steps. So we came to you, it's been a little while now, and showed you sort of a number of different maps where we talked about potential alignments. The intention in developing what is now sort of this group of 11 representative investments is for us to not necessarily like hone in on a specific investment, but to develop investments that allow us to understand how each of them perform relative to each other. And so in order to do that, what we did was develop these investments that include an assumption about mode. So BRT or LRT, and in one case, it's bus on shoulder. Alignment, so sort of how does that particular investment traverse through the region? Terminus, meaning where does that end? General station locations, so where is that particular investment stopping in order to provide access to potential riders? And then the general size and location for park and rides. And so we need to define each of these pieces at a very high level in order for us to use tools to understand how they perform. It's really important to realize that once there is a decision about a preferred representative option to move forward, we will dive much more deeply into that option and sort of optimize it and understand the specifics. But at a high level, we define those things for the purposes of being able to measure how each of them perform. So we developed a total of 11 build options and a no build. And a no build essentially means if the project didn't move forward. So we need to be able to measure to that, to say these are the 11 options if we did build something, and then here's an option where we continue to move forward in time, but an option is not built. So we had one that was bus on shoulder. We had 3 that were bus rapid transit, and then we had 6 that were light rail transit. The last time that we came to see you, we had 4 that were light rail transit. So I'll talk about the 2 new ones. And then we also had an option that included both an extension of light rail from Expo to Hayden Island and an extension of a dedicated BRT from downtown Vancouver to Hayden Island. So the 2 new options are options L and M. And so you can see these maps here. Essentially, option L is an extension from the current terminus of the Max Yellow Line near Expo. It makes its way to Hayden Island, and then it has a station here near the waterfront in downtown Vancouver, another station near Evergreen, and then it terminates near McLaughlin and I-5. And the purpose of developing these 2 new options was in order to see how a station near the waterfront in downtown Vancouver would perform. So both this option and option M, which is essentially the same option, but it terminates near Evergreen instead of continuing to travel north. Again, and we'll get into this a little bit in the presentation, but there was a desire to understand how a waterfront station would perform. So in addition to understanding these general representative investments, we also, as I mentioned, developed 16 measures with the partners with the intention of understanding if you were looking at sort of all of these potential investments, what are the types of measures that help you to understand how they perform relative to each other? So a lot of the measures were really about ridership. So we have a regional model that helps us to sort of understand how an investment of this type would perform in the future. And for the purposes of this conversation, the future is 2045. And so the measures do things like project ridership. They also help us to understand how folks would access an investment. So when we think about transit access, we think about folks that are able to walk or roll, as well as transfer from the existing bus or rail service, as well as folks that might be accessing via park and ride. So driving a personal vehicle, parking it, and then accessing the investment. In addition, one of our measures was specific to access for equity priority communities. And that's something that Jake will be presenting next in more detail. And then we also developed high-level information about costs, both capital costs, so the cost to build a given investment, as well as operations and maintenance costs, so sort of the daily cost of operating an investment. We also looked at a very high level at potential impacts. And that's just based on really high level conceptual design, again, for the purposes of being able to compare across potential investments. Another really important piece of this conversation is really understanding what's happened since 2013. So as I mentioned, the previous program, which was called the Columbia River Crossing, ended its work in 2013. And both C-Tran and the City of Vancouver have done a lot of work since then to really advance transit within Vancouver. So for instance, C-Tran has developed and begun implementation of their Vine BRT network. And that includes 3 lines, one that's in operation, one that is currently in construction, and one that is planned. And the Vine and the C-Tran Express bus service currently provide frequent and reliable service within Clark County and to downtown Portland, respectively. So those express buses make that connection now. When we're thinking about potential transit investments, it's really important that we think about any transit investment should be made with a desire to complement that Vine BRT system, including existing and planned service. In addition, the City of Vancouver has worked with C-Tran to design robust station environments for the Vine system on Broadway and Washington and the Central Business District in Vancouver. I'm sure many of you have had a chance to experience those stations. They're quite lovely. And with these investments in mind, it is desirable to adjust the alignment of a potential future investment to ensure that all modes, light rail, BRT, and express bus, function efficiently within the full transit network and respective operating environments. In addition, the City of Vancouver has seen substantial growth in the waterfront district as planned for in the waterfront development plan. And there's a desire, as we talked a bit earlier, to serve this new development more directly with a transit investment. And that's really the impetus for those 2 new options, option L and option M. And in addition, and very importantly, the population of the region is growing and has grown and diversified quite quickly. So since 2010, Clark County's population has grown by nearly 78,000, and 76% of those, excuse me, of that growth have been people of color. I'm just going to take a drink real quick. Sorry about that. All right. So when we spent the last 2 seasons, so over the fall and the winter, we've developed all the measures for all of those potential investments in transit, and we have some high-level takeaways that we want to share today about that information that we've been developing. So first, all of the build options, so all 11 of those options that we discussed, they substantially improve transit service over the no build, which is to say, building a transit investment is very important and it will serve a lot of people. The second is that there's a lot of demand for cross-river transit service. So even more so than under the previous program, where we were looking at a future investment in 2030, that was the forecast year, and now it's 2045. There's even more people that want to make that movement. And so there's just a lot of demand for transit service. Another really important takeaway, and this one is kind of complicated, but I think it probably makes sense for those of you who currently use transit or live near transit, is that capacity, both at the transit investment level, so the actual investment in transit that we'll be making, as well as the overall system, so the existing transit system, the roads, other things that connect, they're all really important considerations when we're selecting a preferred alternative. So for instance, with light rail alternatives, we really need to think about how that would work within downtown Vancouver, how it would work along Interstate Avenue, which is where the yellow line currently traverses. Also the Rose Quarter, which is where we have buses and rail and cars, and people and bicycles all coming together, as well as, excuse me, the Steel Bridge, which is a really important transit connection into downtown Portland, and the Portland Transit Mall. For BRT options, really important to think about the downtown Vancouver Transit Mall and just how BRT would function within the downtown of Vancouver. And for Express Bus, thinking again about both downtown Vancouver and the Portland Transit Mall, as those buses are making connections on both ends of that trip. A transit investment that serves the identified markets, so all of the places that we're hoping to have transit serve, and attempts to serve all of that demand. So we talked about there's a lot of people that want to make these trips. Really is going to need to include a combination of investments, both in terms of BRT, light rail, and express bus, in order to serve all the folks that are hoping to make that transit connection. It's also important to note that transfers from other transit vehicles are the highest mode of access for all of the representative transit investments. So this really highlights the importance of providing convenient connections to the existing and future CTRAN and TriMet systems. And then when we compare the same representative alignment, so meaning it travels along the same alignment, it has the same stations, it has similar park and rides, LRT options tend to have higher ridership than BRT options. I'm afraid I may have talked too much today. I bet my kids would tell me that. And then a few more early draft findings. The park and ride demand is really robust in all of the representative investment scenarios, with the greatest demand for park and ride attributed to those investments that are most convenient, that have the most convenient access from I-5. And options that include more stations serve more residents within walking distance, including BIPOC and low-income populations. All the transit investments improve access to jobs, including BIPOC and low-income populations. And in general, LRT investments improve access to jobs to a greater degree than BRT investments alone. And a lot of that has to do with sort of the travel time assumptions that are built into the model when we come up with ridership. When comparing the same representative alignment, light rail options have higher capital cost and lower operating cost per rider than BRT options, which is to say light rail is more expensive to build, but typically less expensive to operate. And converse is true as well. So BRT is typically less expensive to build, but slightly more expensive to operate in terms of cost per rider. And a lot of that has to do with how many people can be accommodated on each vehicle. All right, so to the last piece here. So as we are moving forward, we really want to get to sort of a focused list of the representative transit investments that we can then do some work to optimize and make as good as possible. And so you can imagine we have these 11 potential investments, and then we have all these measures. We really want to sort of condense that group so that we can dive in more deeply and really understand the best possible investment for the region. So the representative transit investment development process has taken place, like I said, over the fall and winter, with the goal of better understanding the types of transit investment that would best serve the project corridor in the region. And the process really cast a wide net and included many inputs. So those 16 measures that we talked about briefly, as well as a deeper understanding of what has changed both physically and in planning processes since the CRC program ended, as well as high-level conceptual design to better understand how investments might work within the built environment. The program is tasked with selecting a preferred transit investment that includes mode and alignment this spring. So this is something that Greg touched on in his intro. And as we move closer to that goal, we really want to narrow our focus to just a few representative transit investments that we believe best balance the outputs from all of the measures work that we've done, as well as the discussions from the process to date. And we'd really like to get your feedback on those early draft findings that I touched on to help us guide that winnowing process of moving from a large number of potential investments to something more refined. So in terms of next steps, we are working to define the preferred transit investment for inclusion in the locally preferred alternative. And we're hoping to get your feedback on things like mode, so BRT and LRT, the general alignment, and then other things, of course, that you'd like to share with us. The intention is for us to return to this group in March with a draft sort of winnowing or smaller list of transit investments that we think we would continue to optimize and move forward with one preferred option as the locally preferred alternative. I will stop talking.
All right. Well, thank you, Kelly. How about questions, thoughts, reflections? Our newest member, Albert Lee, welcome. And please.
Thank you. You would think that I could figure out how to unmute myself at this point, having been in 2 years of COVID quarantine. Hello, everyone. My name is Albert Lee. I am the new representative for the Portland NAACP, and I am replacing Lilly as she remains on this for a different capacity. So I had a couple of questions, and I know that I'm late to the game here, so I'm coming in the middle of this all. And I saw, Kelly, in your presentations for option L and option M. And as I was listening, I also was hearing what I heard was more of a preference for LRT over BRT. And my first question was, what is your definition of BRT? Because I think that there are several different ideas of what bus rapid transit is. And then secondly, with regard to BRT under the options, and again, I haven't seen any of the options, would the BRT be focused only on the crossing itself, or would it be dedicated all the way down to Portland? So those are my first two questions.
Great. Yes, happy to answer those questions and welcome. Nice to have you here. So the first question is, how do we define BRT? And you're so right. So a BRT investment is really sort of, it's a whole spectrum of potential investments. And as we mentioned, in Vancouver, they already have a very robust and very successful BRT program. For the purposes of defining this particular investment, we assumed that all of the BRT options were fully dedicated facilities that would tie Vancouver, let's see, I'm trying to think of the best words to describe it. So it's a fully dedicated facility for which the existing BRT lines would make their way onto this new dedicated facility. They would make a connection at Hayden Island, and then they would terminate at the Expo Center, where any trips that would be necessary that would be further south from the Expo would happen via the existing yellow line. So all of the BRT options were assumed to tie into the light rail investment at Expo. Does that answer your question?
Partially. So when it comes to one of the things that I was catching in hearing you is that you said that the light rail has higher capacity, and depending on the type of bus rapid transit you are using, that's an argument. You can have a 3-car bus rapid transit system that would have the same type of capacity that light rail does. And then secondly, if you're going to put a BRT just across the bridge from Hayden Island to the Expo Center and then have people shift over to the yellow line, that's a connection switch point, which causes inefficiencies. And so there's a question as to whether it would make more sense to have a dedicated lane that takes that bus rapid transit all the way down to Portland, so it's avoiding the traffic and also avoiding having your passengers have to switch modes. So, you know, some people look at bus rapid transit and are picturing the same types of buses that we have now. Others are looking at bus rapid transit where you have multiple doors like a subway train or a light rail train, and platforms where people can get in and out rather quickly. I would caution that a simple analysis of the initial cost versus operational costs there's a question to that. As we see increased technology on bus rapid transit, you're getting, if you have a switch to, for instance, electric bus rapid transit, your maintenance costs will be significantly reduced, where your initial input costs are not going to be as high as light rail. And the beauty about bus rapid transit is that you're not forced to remain on one route. You can actually switch that route up in the future as demands dictate.
Agreed. Sorry.
Go ahead.
All really great comments, and you're absolutely correct in that there are all sorts of potential BRT investments. And so, as you can imagine, in this sort of really early transit investment development phase, we had to make a number of assumptions. And so you're absolutely correct that any one of those assumptions could be assumed to operate differently. And that's part of that later sort of optimization phase. For the purposes of this early analysis, it's assumed that a two-car consist of light rail can carry up to 266 people, and that the BRT vehicle, which is also all-door boarding, could hold up to 100 people. And so then it's a question of frequency. But as you can imagine, each of these pieces are things that we can dive into in more detail as a preferred option is selected and as we refine that design. So all really good, important comments.
Other questions? All right, so we are going to move to our next piece with Jake with our transit equity analysis, the first part.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Hunt. And good evening, everybody. So we, as Kelly mentioned, one of our measures that we're looking at with evaluating these different potential investments is, of course, the access and mobility for our equity priority communities. And so what I'm going to share is just an initial findings, initial data from that. And there's certainly more to come. I'll give all those caveats again. Yeah, the focus really on how these different investments might benefit communities. Looking back at our IBR equity objectives from our equity framework, that really is the foundation of the equity work we're doing in this program. Mobility and accessibility, the objective focused on mobility and accessibility is really the foundation for this analysis that I'm sharing. And as a reminder, that objective is to improve mobility, accessibility, and connectivity, especially for lower income travelers, people with disabilities, and historically underserved communities who experience transportation barriers. So this analysis that I'm going to share has really two components. The first is looking at who lives around the different station locations that are included in these different investment scenarios. And it's focused, for what I'm showing here, on BIPOC and low income populations. So the question is, do certain investments serve BIPOC and low income populations or residents better than others in terms of who lives around those stations? The second piece of this analysis, Roberta, did you want to say something? Okay. The second part of this analysis is looking at access to jobs and how those are improved by the different investments. And so the jobs are really used, yes, to answer questions about access specifically to jobs, but jobs are also a good proxy for all types of places that people go. So shopping, services, education, healthcare, et cetera, because people work there and need to work there to provide those services. So it's found to be a pretty good representative measure beyond just looking at access to employment. And then specifically in this case, to what degree would access to these jobs and services improve for BIPOC and low-income populations when comparing across the different investments? Here's a bunch of caveats. Can't be too careful. So keep in mind that what this analysis of potential walking access and mobility benefits from these different investments, these investment scenarios. It's geared towards, for now, geared towards Title VI guidelines, which focus, that's Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, and that's focused specifically on communities of color and low-income populations. And so that it doesn't include right now all of our equity priority communities that are in our established equity definition. And then this analysis and the use of it is one component of the IBR equity commitment. Of course, it's not the whole thing. What this is not, it's not an analysis of bike access or park and ride access to stations in terms of equity priority communities. So that's forthcoming. It's not adequate to totally understand all the benefits, all the burdens of the program and even of the transit options. So things like mobility and access benefits from other elements of the program, like the bicycle facilities and pedestrian facilities. It doesn't look at property impacts when building these facilities or these investments. That is also forthcoming. It's not a comprehensive review of all transit investments and equity initiatives in the region. It's focused specifically on what would change with IBR. And it's not inclusive of the actions that need to be taken for communities to realize these benefits. We know that for people to be able to access quality transit, they need to stay in place and live near that transit before and after that investment, and things like gentrification and displacement that occur as property values increase. That's a risk. And so this basically assumes that that will be the case in the future, that those folks will still live here. And so that doesn't just happen on its own. All right, so that with all of that said, we'll get into the analysis. So in looking at populations, residents who live near stations, again, as Kelly went over, we have these 10 different representative transit investments. She actually talked about 11. I am saying 10 because I'm not including bus on shoulder here. That's assumed to be included in all of the investments. And so right here, I'm showing a map that includes all of these different types of investments, color coded. So there's 3 that would go from Expo to Turtle Place in downtown Vancouver. But one is light rail, one's BRT, and one is a combo of the 2. There's 2 that are the 2013 LPA, the locally preferred alternative, where that project landed, and both an LRT option and a BRT option of that. LRT and BRT options between Expo Center all the way up to Kiggins Bowl. That's north of 39th Street in Vancouver. And then there's 3 options, and Kelly highlighted 2 of these, which basically highlights all 3. Between Expo, going to Hayden Island, going to one of those options does not include a waterfront station. It just goes to Evergreen and then McLaughlin, where Clark College is. The other one does add that waterfront station, and then one doesn't go all the way to Clark College, but it does also include that waterfront station. So looking at the where people can access these stops via walking, we used walk sheds. And what this walk shed concept is where's the actual area that folks can walk within a half mile. That half mile is generally understood to be a reasonable walking distance for a high capacity transit option. You can't just draw a circle that's a half mile in radius around a place, because people can't walk everywhere just in a straight line for a half mile. So these funny looking shapes are called walk sheds. And what I'm showing here is around all those different stations of all the different investment scenarios. This is kind of what they look like, just to give you an idea of how this was done. And then here I'm showing a table that summarizes this demographic information. So I'll walk through this a little. They're color coded and grouped based on the alignment that they do, the route that they take. We have 2 that go between Expo and Kiggins Bowl, like I mentioned. And those have the greatest number of BIPOC residents and low-income residents within a half mile of those stations. They also include 6 stations. And that's kind of logical. You build more stations, you're gonna have more people who live around those, generally speaking. Next in this, we have the 2013 LPA, both the light rail and bus rapid transit, because this analysis assumed they'd have the same station locations. Those are the next highest with about 1,300 BIPOC residents, about 1,500 or 1,600 low-income residents. And the percentages, you can also note, that's the percentage of the total population who are BIPOC or who are low income. So across these, it's about a quarter of the population that is BIPOC, so Black, Indigenous, people of color, just as a reminder. And then it ranges between about 30 and 40% who are low income, which is pretty high for the region. The region is closer down to 30 on average. So then they go down the routes that would go between Expo up to either Evergreen or McLaughlin are the next highest in terms of number of residents served. And then the bottom three are the ones that just go between Expo Center and into Turtle Place in downtown Vancouver. So a couple of takeaways that I alluded to a little bit. The longer transit alignments and more stations generally means more residents within a half-mile walk, and that's true for all residents. It's also true for BIPOC and low-income residents. These investments do appear to be pretty similar in terms of the percentage of the populations who live around them that are BIPOC and low-income. The one exception, I'll go back to this. You look at in the purple investment I, LRT Expo to I-5 in McLaughlin, it's about 31% of that population that's low income, and that's lower than the others. So meaning it's maybe skews a little bit higher income than the other ones by comparison. So that's the first piece of the analysis, just looking at who lives around stations. But obviously, there's a lot more to these investments than just who lives nearby. And I see we've got a question from Lily, so happy to take that.
Thanks, Jake. I, as always, love your analyses. I'm confused, and it might be because I missed the last meeting. So I apologize if I'm asking questions about things that folks have already covered. But can you go back to your slide one more? Thank you. I don't understand what I'm seeing on the table to the left here. Can you tell me what the color coding is and what am I looking at when I look across, and what am I looking at when I look down? If you could just walk me through that quickly, I would be really grateful.
Sure thing. So it's grouped, each column is the different type of, so you have light rail, bus rapid transit, and then the one option that's a combination of both. The colors correspond to the lines on the map. And so in yellow there, those Expo to Turtle Place. Let's see if I can, my cursor showing. Okay, so you can see Expo here, and then you can kind of, it's a little, you kind of see this yellow line that goes up to Turtle Place. So that's what those investments would be, that we're assuming kind of the same alignment. The green here with this LPA, that goes across here and then up through downtown Vancouver over to Clark College.
Okay, so maybe I see how the colors correspond to the lines on the map. Mm-hmm. It's confusing to me that, for example, all of the options that are under LRT would not be also in the hybrid LRT plus BRT. If it's LRT plus BRT, wouldn't it be both of the options that are in LRT and BRT on their own?
So, okay, so the hybrid option, so all of these, all the way from Expo to wherever they go, under the light rail column and the BRT column, they are exclusively that. So the light rail ones, they're all, the hybrid option would go, it goes Expo to Hayden Island as light rail, I believe, and then, correct me if I'm wrong, Kelly, and then from Hayden Island on to Turtle Place, it's BRT instead.
I see. Okay, that's helpful. I have other questions, but I can't articulate them now, so I'm gonna let Albert go and I'll
Sure.
raise my hand if I can articulate them in a second.
Sure, thanks, Lily.
So before Albert goes, one request that I have is, so occasionally can we throw in, instead of saying LRT, can we throw in light rail so that we're all with the conversation? And then the next one, I am needing you as you talk about these things, because I look at this pretty picture and it's hard for me to get it.
Mm-hmm.
So if, like you just did when you talked to Lily, Jake, when you said you kind of talked the line through, and you said for I think the line, the green line, that is going from LPA, and what is LPA?
The locally preferred alternative. So it's
Okay.
what the,
From 2013.
yeah.
So the 2013. So you're saying when you say that was the so the plan from a while back, the locally preferred alternative from a while ago, started at the Expo Center and then it went up and stopped at Clark College.
Yeah, it served Hayden Island and then it went to, I don't recall if it had, I don't think it had a waterfront station, but it went through downtown Vancouver where there's now the Vine serves. There's a couplet of streets that it went. The Vine serves that now.
So
yes, then it went over to Clark College.
So if it is just possible, as you're telling the story, if you could just give a bit more details so that I can form more of a mental picture in my mind, that's my one request.
Absolutely.
So, and Albert, your question.
Thank you, Dr. Hunt. Jake, thank you for your presentation. I first wanted to start off with your caveat with regard to where people live may not be where they will be once this is all said and done. And I'm going to give you a real world example. I've spent the last 25 years living in DC and in Portland. When I first moved to DC in a neighborhood called Columbia Heights, they just got the rail system in there. And my local Catholic church, when I first moved there in 1999, had Mass in English, Spanish, Haitian Creole, and Vietnamese. Now, if you go back to that same Columbia Heights, there are $3,000 efficiency apartments, and that local church now only has Mass in English and in Spanish. Each of the stops along all of the WMATA rail lines are effectively little city-states of wealth, and people have been pushed further out into the hinterlands because of the development. So I do not see how wherever you put the stops on your BRT or LRT line, I don't see people remaining in those spaces without additional policies that will protect them against the onslaught of gentrification. And then my second and larger question, again, I apologize because this is my first meeting with you all, but with regard to this whole entire project, is the public transit part just an add-on or to a bridge project that is mainly focused on getting the cars and the trailers going through the state? Is the public transit just an add-on, or are you effectively, when you put out these policies, you can change behavior, you can change the modes and the systems in which people use or utilize? So, I mean, are you trying to get people out of cars? Because if that's the case, I'm kind of lost on the focus on car parks and things of that nature, because that harkens back to the way things exist as it is right now, as opposed to where they could be going. So if you can unpack a question out of that all, that'd be great. An answer to that question.
So Albert, let me take your last question about the commitment of this program to the transit mode. Currently, we're looking at a project that is ranging between $3.2 to $4.8 billion. And currently, depending on which transit mode is selected, the transit mode will be up to 1/3 of the overall cost of this program. So we are serious about transit. We're serious about making this a multimodal corridor to give people choices to take a different way to cross through this 5-mile section of the interstate. We're also focused on creating both bike, walk, rolling mode to connect to desired locations where people want to go. So we recognize that the automotive mode cannot be take on the burden of the future in this corridor. We know that this has to be a shared burden between all modes. So we are taking this tremendously serious. It's not just something that's slapped on or added on in that type of manner. So it's something that we are spending a tremendous amount of time and effort to try and get this right. So hopefully, with as we move forward, folks will see that there will be better options. Currently, the current bridge as it exists is very limited in those options. And we're trying to create a modern structure that can accommodate both the automobile mode, because that's not going away, but also create a transit mode and a active transportation mode that can accommodate folks who want to do something different.
Thank you.
So Jake, I'll kick it back to you to answer the rest of that question.
Yeah, and this is certainly, I want to make sure that we have time in our small group discussions, because one of the things is, what else do we need to be considering? And that's, you're spot on, Albert, and that's a bigger conversation than this for sure. It's something that we have begun to talk about in terms of the strategies and policies and partnerships implement to try to do what we can to help people stay in place and enjoy the investments in their communities where they already are. But a lot more to come there for sure. I see Meg, you've got your hand up.
I do. Hi, this is Meg Johnson. I have a quick question about the walk sheds. That was a couple of slides forward, if I'm not mistaken. Thank you. For the walk sheds, does this include truly accessible spaces? I know for a fact that a lot of the station stops in the Vancouver area that we're going to be discussing, within several miles of those spaces, there are no sidewalks on a lot of those streets. Are they going to be accessible for everyone who's, multiply abled? So not just walking, but also any kind of other rolling or any situation of that nature? Right. This does not, it considers the street network, and it assumes that's, I'm trying to remember if it does incorporate sidewalk infrastructure specifically, or it assumes that on, except for arterial streets, that you can walk there. But no, it doesn't consider like even, are there curb ramps or other elements to make them truly accessible. So this was just trying to get to populations and the demographics there. But I am sure that this isn't going out on a limb, that with any station investments and construction, access to that station that's truly accessible for bicycles and pedestrians of all kinds is going to be a crucial part of that investment.
So if I can just jump in on that issue, one of the things that we will be looking at in regards to community benefits will be those type of improvements outside of the actual footprint of the program to make sure that folks who have to traverse and get to stations will have that unimpeded access. So this will be a part of a larger regional investment to make sure that if I am differently abled, I will be able to reach these stations in a safe and secure manner. So we're not just going to build stations and say, get to it the best way you can. And we know that that is not the intent of the partners for this, but we will be looking at ways to address those type of overall connectivity and safety issues.
This is Matt. Jake, I have a question.
Yeah.
So first of all, thank you to you and to Kelly for the presentation. I just wanted to ask, because I can't exactly pick out everything on what's being shared on the screen, but were you able to identify some similar characteristics between that and communities with disabilities? I'll let you answer that first, but I do have a follow-up question to that.
That is a crucial next step in this. We started with the Title VI focus, and then that, like I mentioned with equity priority communities in our definition, yes, that's coming next as well.
Right. Okay. So follow-up question then, and not to get too Vancouver centric here. My apologies, Portland. So looking at, I think if I remember the numbers correctly, it was 20% seniors and 20% people with disabilities within the program area on the Vancouver side. We already have feedback in hand from some of the community feedback sessions as to which transportation options would not be viable for the communities with disabilities, would not improve the situation for communities with disabilities. With that information feedback in hand about how do we apply that kind of to what your and Kelly's presentation is tonight, and how can we move forward with that information to narrow down these options?
You are teeing up nicely. Our Audrey Bomar from the program is also going to be presenting on our community engagement process and some of those findings. So okay. That, yes, that's a crucial element of this as well that is important to include because of shortcomings of this type of analysis and that. So yes, that's
okay. Then I'll hold back on my other questions until that. I didn't know when that was going to come. So thank you very much.
You're good. I know I'm a little behind. I do have another piece of this analysis to go through. So stick with me for a minute here, because the other element is looking at potential improvements in access to jobs. So what this analysis is it's based on a model of looking at projected jobs in 2045 and how long it'll take for folks to access those jobs on the different transit investment options. So something to remember though is these projected jobs is 2045, but it's current demographics. So back again to Albert's point, it's one of those kind of shortcomings that we can't quite project the demographics, and we need to have intentional strategies to try to avoid displacement. So the baseline of this is the projected 2045 transit network. So all the investments that are planned on the books, that's the baseline, saying that we have all these things that we know we're going to do between CTRAN and TriMet. And if there wasn't an IBR transit solution, that's the sort of no build that we compare to. The travel time that we look at includes walking and riding transit as well, and which includes transfers to and from all other, again, projected transit services and existing transit services today. And it looks at access to jobs for residents of the IBR program area That's both the Washington and Oregon sides. That's what I'm showing here. There's a lot more analysis that I am doing a technical memo to include, but this one just looks at residents of the program area. So here I'm showing a map that displays in darker colors areas of the region where if you took a 45-minute transit trip in 2045 from that location, the darker the color, the more jobs you'd be able to reach if you started there. On top of that, it shows the projected network, as I mentioned, that this model assumes is in place in addition to whatever high capacity transit IBR option we look at. So an example of how to interpret this, if I were to take transit from downtown Vancouver, again in 2045, without an IBR solution, I would be able to reach about 50,000 to 100,000 jobs within 45 minutes during the midday. That's why you can kind of see it's a little bit darker purple there, but not the darkest purple. There are some areas where you can reach more jobs in 45 minutes. So looking again at the general IBR program area, I'm showing here a map that shows our equity index. Darker areas are where our equity priority communities tend to be concentrated according to census data. So we have some darker areas in downtown Vancouver, as well as along Fourth Plain Boulevard. So just wanted to show that we're talking about residents of this area and the jobs that they would be able to reach on transit. Sharing here another map that's the City of Vancouver's Equity and Essential Places map. It also includes their existing bus rapid transit, the Vine, and planned Vine routes. And then it also overlays demographics to kind of show where investments have been made in that community, because they've made an intentional effort to prioritize equity and to serve communities who are a priority in terms of equity. And these are the beginning of some of the results. So in 45 minutes during the midday, if we can compare across all of those different transit investments, comparing what that looks like in terms of improvement to jobs access for BIPOC and white populations. So what this is showing is if we didn't do anything on IBR, we're projecting that in 2045, within 45 minutes, the average BIPOC person, and you can ask me as an aside how that's done, can reach about 26,000 jobs. The average white person, on the other hand, can reach about 24,000 jobs in 45 minutes. Again, projected in 2045. How that increases along these different options, we see some differences. I won't go through all of these, but I'll point out some of the highest improvements in terms of numbers and the percentage improvement. The 2013 LPA, the locally preferred alternative, which was light rail, looked like it improved access to jobs under this model pretty significantly by about 110% for both BIPOC and white populations. That's also a similar finding on if we went with light rail from Expo to Kagan's Bowl, if we went light rail Expo to McLaughlin and light rail Expo to McLaughlin with a waterfront station. But all of these options would improve access to jobs pretty significantly and also pretty consistently across when we compare BIPOC and white populations. But I'll get to some takeaways later and you can explore this data on your own. So 60-minute trip, because it's important to look at that as well, an hour transit trip, similar findings, it's obviously more jobs that you can access in that time. And the increases are still very substantial. In some cases, not quite as high in comparison, 45 minutes under a no build versus 45 minutes under these. But I see I saw John raise his hand and then Haitan. So
Hey, yeah, Jake, can you, I guess this applies to this as well. You're showing the populations as like population benefits, and specifically on the last slide. And the only thing that makes me question those, we know that the populations aren't not equal in terms of size, right? So if I understood the last slide showing, roughly the same number of people benefiting, because you're combining all races in one and white on the other, the benefits to the BIPOC population is much greater as a percentage, right?
yeah, well, it depends on which one you're looking at. But these aren't people. I should clarify. These are the number of jobs, and it's the way it's done is sort of it's taking an average for the average person, the average BIPOC person, the average white person, based on where people live. It's this whole complicated calculation. But yeah, it's supposed to be for that average person in the program area, how many jobs they can reach and how many more jobs by the different transit options.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Hi, Ton.
Hey, thanks, Jack. It's very interesting analysis. So I want to ask, when you say job, does it mean like all kind of jobs, or just a specific type of job that is more that will fulfill the immediate need of employment for the BIPOC or the low income population?
For this model uses all types of jobs.
So yeah, so I think it might be more accurate if we can filter it out for the jobs that are more suitable for immediate employment need of the low income or the BIPOC target population. Because if we talk about like increasing the access to job, we're not talking about people who take bus to work as a software engineer work, right? So I think that could give us a more comparable and more practical result to compare.
I do think it's good to look at both, just since it is, like I mentioned, it's jobs, but it's also jobs are a proxy for a lot of other things that people access. I don't know if that's necessarily possible within the model. That's something we have to check, but there is a different kind of analysis we might be able to do to look at jobs by wage and jobs by, by wage or by industry.
Totally agree. So we can look at that in different lens. Just think that there are more ways to look at that. Yeah, thank you.
No, I think that's a great point. So another kind of caveat for this. I think since we're running a bit on time and I don't want to cut too much in discussion, I'll quickly go through these charts. Just that these two next charts show compare low income and higher income populations, and the average, again, low income person, average higher income person. Our low income definition is provided there at or below 200% the federal poverty level. Again, jobs increase across the board. There are some differences that I'll note on our takeaway slides, but I provided 45-minute and 60-minute access for all of the different options or investment scenarios that we're looking at. Here are the takeaways that as I see them, as we've seen them as an equity team, and in working with some of our partners. But there's certainly more, and we want to talk with you all about that. But one of them is that, similarly with Kelly's point about ridership generally being better as modeled for light rail versus bus rapid transit, that's also true in terms of greater benefit in terms of jobs, increased jobs access. So light rail seems to perform better in increasing access to jobs. All of the investments looked at would increase job access for BIPOC and low-income populations on average, and it's as high as twice as much. Folks would reach 2 times as many jobs in 45 or 60 minutes for several of the options, B, I, J, and L. And then most of the investments would increase job access for BIPOC program area residents as much as or even more than white residents. But there are a few exceptions. H, J, and M, it's actually a little higher of an increase for white residents. And then the investments are kind of mixed when we're looking at just the program area, little mixed in terms of how they improve access for low income versus higher income residents of the program area.
Jay?
Yeah.
I'm sorry for interrupting. When you say H, G, and M, you lost me a little.
Those HJ, those just the letters on the previous charts. They're all they're all assigned a letter, so you kind of have to refer back to that just to.
Okay, so refer back.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
And when I say investments are kind of mixed, I mean that some of them seem to improve access more for low income compared to higher income. Some appear to increase access more for higher income compared to lower income for residents of the program area. I've run this analysis looking at the average resident whole, the average resident of the Rose Village, Fourth Plain Village area, that darker area on the equity index map that's an equity priority area. Those actually low income residents look to stand to increase job access more or just as much as higher income across the board. So kind of depends on where we're looking, but that's just something to note in terms of where the results sort of differ. So I can take a few questions now. I think we're definitely running behind, but I think I can take a question or two. Albert?
Jake, thanks. So when you're doing that analysis from LRT versus BRT, again, it seems flawed in that you're using a definition of BRT if we're going back to the previous presenter, a definition, a base version of BRT versus an optimal version of BRT. So I'm not sure whether that whole analysis is, necessarily sound. If you're using yesteryear's BRT and using tomorrow's LRT, it seems like it's kind of big to move it to LRT over BRT. To me, it feels like it's being baked to consider light rail over bus rapid transit. That's the feeling that I'm getting.
And I can't necessarily speak to what the detail, like as far as I know from the model, and maybe Kelly can help here. It's modeled for what the BRT investments are anticipated to be. But Kelly, I don't know if you know the more detailed what's included in those.
Yeah, I think this gets a little bit at your previous comments as well. So you're correct in that in order to do this work, we have to make assumptions about the types of investments that would be made. And so again, this is an assumption where the BRT options tie into the yellow line. And so one of the things that makes the travel time, sort of the number of jobs that can be reached higher with BRT, is that there's always an extra transfer, right? So if you're traveling further south than Expo, then you're transferring to the light rail at Expo. And so that, of course, does factor into the desirability, as you know, as a transit rider, of selecting that mode. But it does also have an impact on the number of jobs that you can reach within a given time period.
Right. So you've shown us today a couple of a new models. What was it, L and M? Do any of the previous versions have a BRT that goes down to Portland?
So in the very early work that was done for the Columbia River Crossing project, so that draft environmental impact statement did include some BRT options. That was like the mid 2000s. The issue with that is that we at this point don't have a situation where we're able to dedicate a lane to transit all the way to downtown Portland. And so the intention was to develop investment potential around a dedicated transit facility. And so for the time being, the assumption is that in order for that to occur, it would need to tie into the existing dedicated facility, which in this case is the yellow line for MAX.
Okay, so if that is the case, then there should not be an analysis of comparing BRT to LRT, because this isn't really showing you a real apples to apples consideration because of that additional transit point to the yellow line.
I think I hear what you're saying, and also wanting to be clear that we wanted to identify the best possible BRT investments that could be made given the constraints in regard to wanting to have a dedicated facility. Does that make sense?
Not really, but okay.
I'd be happy to chat with you offline. I understand that you're just starting in this role, and we're grateful for your time, but also happy to sort of get you up to speed in terms of the previous work or any additional questions that you might have.
Certainly.
Sounds good.
All right, so facilitation moment. We are, we have the fall community engagement group that's reporting. That's about, we've allotted about 15 minutes for that. So for this conversation, I'm good to go for about, maybe about 6 more minutes. And then an artificial cut and to the fall community engagement. Yeah, so that's what we're gonna do. So Lily, you're up next.
Thank you. And I appreciate the timekeeping. So one of my understandings about bus rapid, as Albert was mentioning, true bus rapid transit, is that it's much more flexible and is much more adaptable in the future to the needs of the communities around the stations that have been projected. And I'm wondering if that has been a part of this analysis.
I would, as far as my analysis, no. it's as modeled. But Kelly, did you say anything there?
Yeah, so at a high level, in terms of sort of capturing the pros and cons of each of the modes, that certainly the nimbleness of BRT is definitely high on the list. You're absolutely right that BRT is able to be more nimble than a rail investment.
Okay, thank you.
John?
Yeah, I just want to make sure I understand the big questions here. If I understand what Kelly was saying, it sounds like the planning involves current roadways or light rail tracks or whatnot. And if to sort of specifically on the Portland side, to do a true or maybe the more flexible model of BRT, we would have to plan on building potentially another road or access point from, let's say, Expo Center to downtown. Is that kind of what you were saying? And I definitely understand how that technically wasn't part of the discussion, because that would be an increasing in roads. But maybe I misunderstand how you said that.
Thank you for the question. And I feel like I do my better talking at the early part of the day, so I apologize if the words I'm using are confusing. But the intention was to look at, identify, and model transit options that were fully dedicated facilities. So the facility for which the purpose would be to transport transit vehicles. And so for the purposes of the analysis that you saw today, that both I presented and what Jake presented, it assumes that all of those BRT options, again, tie into the yellow line for any trips that are being made south of Expo. You would be doing that via the MAX yellow line. Very early on in the previous analysis, there was a look at different types of BRT investments. And some of those were just sort of highway running BRT options. But for this particular analysis, we just assumed that the BRT options would tie in at Expo, which is the existing MAX light rail line. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I think you're using facilities, and I guess in my mind, I'm hearing lanes. Is that appropriate?
Yes, we did not. For this purpose, we did not assume that transit would have a dedicated lane on I-5 all the way to Portland. we did not do that.
Thank you.
Okay. So I want to say, also, Kelly, please don't apologize at all for your communication to the best you can. We all are, so thank you. This is really complicated. Also, thank you everyone for the complexity of your questions and for making sure, for asking, do we understand? Because this is very complicated. And I think I saw a hand that needs to go. Lily.
Thanks. I wasn't sure if I was still within the 6 minutes. Can you, is there one of these lettered options that involves both light rail and BRT across the river? I'm looking at the chart and I can't tell. Can you tell me?
Yeah, just the one that's G hybrid LRT BRT. So that's the one that would go Expo north to Hayden Island as light rail, and then bus rapid transit from Hayden Island up to Vancouver.
Oh, but nothing is BRT from Expo across the river and light rail across the river.
Oh, right.
Is there a reason why that's not one of the, is that not possible for some reason?
It certainly is something that would be possible. And that would be, I think, one of those things that would be a refinement conversation. And so if I think about, like, for instance, the Telecom investment that we have in the Portland region, that is able to accommodate both buses as well as rail. And so for the time being, we're assuming a single mode investment, but that would be something that we could talk about in more detail once a preferred option is selected and we're refining that investment.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to artificially cut this off and go towards fall community engagement and see if that illuminates some more for us. So thank you, Kelly. And hello, Audrey.
Hello, good evening, everyone. I'm going to try to go a little bit fast through this presentation just to make up some time. You guys have had a lot of detailed technical information, and so hopefully this will be a little bit lighter, and certainly I expect to answer questions. So if those of you facilitating could help me, I'm not able to see hand raises.
So, and Audrey, I have 15 minutes for you.
Okay.
So please don't try to go fast and lose us. So please, make the points you need to make.
Great, thank you. So I'm here to give you guys a quick rundown of the effort that we did as a team in the fall to collect community feedback on the design options. So we asked about all of the design options under consideration. Today, you've heard a lot about the transit ones, as well as we asked about river crossing options and Hayden Island interchange and Marine Drive interchange options. So next slide, please. This presentation, I'll run through real quick the kind of what we did and how we collected the input, and then a summary of sort of the high level feedback we heard overall, but really focus on feedback that we heard specific to transit to just kind of keep with the topic you guys have talked about for most of this evening. So in the community engagement, we did a survey, we offered community briefings, in listening sessions. The listening sessions were a partnership with our CBO mini grant recipients, and we're able to offer affinity sessions specific to certain groups. And so we did a collected feedback to be able to report out both quantitative and qualitative results on those design option feedback. So we really tried to reach a variety of people through this effort, using a variety of different media and advertising and notification channels. So we did online, digital, social media advertising, print advertising, advertising on through our transit partners, on TriMet bus stations and benches, as well as C-Tran buses inside wrap cards. So we really tried to kind of get out, and we did some canvassing in the community, dropping off flyers, linking people to the survey and to the information about how to join one of the briefings or listening sessions. Next slide, please. Thank you. As you know, we did offer a specific link to the survey that collected feedback just from our advisory group. So I wanted to highlight and thank everyone on this advisory group for participating and using that link so we could kind of look at the overall information collected. The results in general reflected our overall results, but there are a few key areas where we saw a different set of data come back from the advisory group surveys than we did from the overall. Some of those are called out here, and I'll touch on a couple more as we go through the presentation. So we heard that the advisory group members, and I'm speaking of both the community advisory group as well as this group, the equity advisory group, prioritized improving safety as the top priority for the river crossing configuration, whereas the overall feedback from the community prioritized travel time for the river crossing configuration. Nearly half indicated no preference for how to access Hayden Island versus the overall did specify a preference for how to access Hayden Island. And then travel time was more often ranked as an important priority when consideration of a new transit design option. So the advisory group ranked travel time at 71% of responses prioritized travel time, whereas it was 63% overall. Still consistent though that travel time is of the highest priority for both groups or all of the groups. Overall takeaways from the survey. I'm not going to read through the slides, but I did want to note that we have published our community engagement report. It's posted on the IBR website, and you can really dig into the details on all of the design options in there, but these were some of the consistent takeaways that we heard kind of qualitatively from all of the different forms of outreach we did. So from the survey, as well as those listening sessions and briefings. A desire to both relieve congestion and reduce greenhouse gas emissions was one of those key takeaways. Trip time, ease of trip, and avoiding a toll reported as most influential factors when choosing how to travel across the bridge. Number of lanes, the feedback was sort of mixed, with some wanting to see as many lanes as would, possible to increase flow of traffic, whereas quite a bit of feedback also in the opposite direction with concern around environmental concerns. And then the most important values and priorities expressed for the design options included improving travel times for vehicles and public transit, improving safety for all users, and reducing congestion on I-5, and then improving access and connectivity between North Portland, Vancouver, and Hayden Island. Again, I'll just emphasize that improving travel times was for both participants who primarily used a vehicle to travel, as well as those who primarily used public transit. Probably not surprising to you all. We did, in the survey questions, one of the strategies we used when asking the community for feedback was, rather than asking on specific design options, as we knew kind of design options were still being refined and developed and could change, we really focused on gathering input around the priorities and what people really liked about different designs versus which specific design. So you'll find some of the feedback we have in here really focuses on some of those attributes associated with, in this case, we'll talk about more about transit, but for the overall options that were being studied. Next slide. Okay. So we did offer, as I mentioned, and I believe you've all had a presentation about the mini grant program that the IBR program offered in partnership with community-based organizations. The outcome, or really the purpose around those listening sessions, was to be able to create affinity sessions for specific communities, and we presented information about the design options, really allowing for the participants to learn about some of this really detailed information, as well as provide us feedback. And again, I won't read through the slide. I'll let you take a look at those on your own time. But one thing that was a big takeaway from these events was just how much the participants valued having that affinity space to be able to provide feedback to the program. We know that surveys don't necessarily reach all populations and aren't the preferred method for some people. And we wanted to make sure we were able to capture feedback from as many people as possible. And so it's a really important point to, or something to note, is that we're really weighing and considering both the qualitative and the quantitative feedback we've received through all these various engagement opportunities. So I will jump into some information specific around the high capacity transit design options. Again, as I noted, travel time ranked as the most important attribute when we asked people what about a transit system was most important. So you can see in the bar graph on the slide, travel time was ranked by 63%. Next was level of service, which included frequency, days of service, etc., at 43%. And then the next three are all around 33%, which are access points, so proximity to origin and destinations, safety, and reliability. In a question where we asked users or participants how they would access a new transit option, 55% said they would access it via a car through a park and ride location. There was, we did analyze the data we had and cross-tabbed it so we could get some, dig in a little bit deeper. And so we looked at results across Oregon versus Washington. We broke down some of the demographic information that we collected, and were able to look at different responses based on age, white, Caucasian versus non-white participants, as well as we did collect some information about income, but we found that the data was a little bit hard to really get some clear, definitive data points around income. So we did have some of that crosstab data available. And so in this slide presentation, as well as in the report, you'll see where we've pulled out anywhere where one of those specific groups overall feedback differed from the overall feedback. So in this case, on the slide, you can see Oregon residents, when asked about how they would access a potential new transit system, Oregon residents were more likely to access it via walking or biking than their Washington counterparts. Youth placed a higher priority on cost to user when considering transit, and then half of all respondents actually chose to skip questions related to transit. So I think, as I said in the beginning, we had about 10,000 participants take our survey, and we were able to see how many, kind of skipped which questions. None of the questions were required. And we found that about half of, it was around 6,000 participants chose to respond to transit questions in the transit section. This is also more survey data. When asked about the location of a transit station they would most likely be able, or would most likely use, we asked participants to select two. And this is one area where we did see some differentiation among the different groups. So non-white respondents reported they would use the Vancouver waterfront or somewhere near Vancouver waterfront and Clark College as their top two. Youth respondents indicated similar preferences with an emphasis on station locations near Vancouver waterfront and Clark College. And then the advisory group member data showed Clark College actually as the top, and then second was near Higgins Bowl. The survey did contain an open-ended comment at the very end that allowed folks to provide any other feedback that they wanted to make sure we considered. We did receive out of the 10,000 survey participants about 1,700 comments in that section, and over 750 of the 1,700 mentioned transit. So our team went ahead and coded all of those for sentiment and keywords, and we found that 67% of those 750 comments expressed support for expanding transit options across the bridge, while 30% were unsupportive of any transit expansion. Next slide. So some key takeaways. One of the other ways we did outreach and engagement around the design options was through our community working groups. And we had 4 different community working groups that met twice during the fall, each one twice, so 8 meetings total. And they were focused on Hayden Island, downtown Vancouver, commuters, and active transportation. So none of them were specific around high capacity transit, but all of them had some level of information or questions around transit. And so some of the overall takeaways are here on the screen. Again, I won't read through them, but just generally overall support for improving high capacity transit.
Just so we're clear, we have 5 more minutes for this.
Okay.
You may not read through all of them, but would you, can you just differentiate some of them?
Yeah, absolutely. We're actually right at the end. So from the key takeaways, again, lots of support across all 4 working groups for high capacity transit improvement. Desire for multiple options that are efficient and reliable, again, aligning with the survey feedback about travel time being the highest priority. And an increase for parking availability at park and rides and support to help support transit use. And then greater connectivity from Clark County into Portland and to the regional transit system. And then a desire for increased access to downtown Vancouver and the new waterfront. So I think next steps, I'll just zip through this. As you know, feedback will be considered in the decision-making process for identifying the modified locally preferred alternative. And it'll be, the community feedback will be kind of considered alongside the technical information, which you just heard about, the equity analysis that you also heard about. All of our partners and agencies are providing lots of input and feedback. And so all of those things will be combined together to help decision makers decide on and identify the modified LPA. So.
All right, so we have 4 minutes. So if everyone can be concise with their questions and as concise as possible with their answers. Lily.
Thank you. Concisely, will the disaggregated data be available in your report? I'm very interested in seeing the disaggregated tables.
Yes, so in the report, we do have a breakdown of each question and the results for each question. in the appendix, I'll point you straight to where you can find a direct download of all of the data points for each of the questions. If you want to get some of that cross-tabbed data and some of the details, we definitely can provide that. We have it in a very wonky spreadsheet that really wasn't desirable for posting on our website, but is available.
I would like to see that. Thank you.
Okay, Meg.
Hi, this is Meg. Along the same lines as Lily brought up, was there a huge difference of opinion when it came to all of these points when people are in Oregon or in Washington where they reside, as opposed to where they travel?
We did not find any really starkly different feedback from Oregon residents than we did from Washington residents. We weren't able to pinpoint, say, someone from Hayden Island or downtown Vancouver. And so I think if you kind of could dive in a little bit deeper, but again, people were not required to share their location and information about where they travel to and from. And so some of that data isn't as clean for us to be able to analyze. But in general, it was very similar across both states. We did find quite a bit of, preference or wanting improvements related to bicycle and pedestrian use and access in Oregon than we did in Washington. And then specific to Hayden Island, which we'll get into some of the more detailed data around Hayden Island when you guys get those presentations in the coming weeks and months. But we did find that people in Oregon had more to say about how they wanted to access Hayden Island. So there was some differentiation in that space as well.
I would also add I think it was a 60-40 split between Washington and Oregon residents. So if that tells you anything about interest and enthusiasm about the project, then that's one
So
thing.
60% were Washington residents who were, oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Thanks for that, Jake.
That's shocking to me. Exciting, but shocking.
Hey, Brent, can you tell us how many folks do we have in the queue for public comment?
Right now, we don't have anyone in the queue for public comment.
Okay.
I'll pull up the screen that gives those instructions though.
Okay. All right, so Audrey, stick around for a minute. We're going to introduce public comment. If we don't have any takers, we'll kick it back. Comment instructions. Oh, Janelle, that's you.
You're doing great, Dr. Hunt. Feel free to continue unless you'd like me to.
Comment instructions. To make a live comment via phone, dial 253-215-8782. The meeting ID 986-0940-5983. Passcode 701376. Dial *9 to raise your hand. The facilitator will call on participants to provide comment. Dial *6 to unmute yourself. Please provide your name and affiliation. Commentators will be given 2 minutes to speak. If we run out of time and you have not had a chance to speak, you can still provide comments after the meeting. What I did notice from last time was that if you call in, it's good to mute your YouTube so that you're not hearing yourself in lag and feeling the frustration of that. All right, so I'm going to go back to Audrey if there are other questions. No. Great. Again, I'm floored. Okay, Audrey, is there a closing comment that you want to make?
No, but thank you. I just want to thank everyone here for participating in the survey and for allowing me the opportunity to provide this report out. And if there's anything I can provide any of you to be able to get you all that data, please let Jake know and we'll get that over. And perhaps we'll send out a link to the community engagement report after this meeting so folks have that handy. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Salome, would you talk about the upcoming Black History Month panel that's on Friday?
Yes, so hello everyone, it's good to see you all or hear from you all. We have an event happening this Friday. It is a roundtable discussion featuring some of the people who are involved in the Interstate Bridge Replacement Program. The topic is going to be Black community and their relationships with infrastructure. Some of the members here at the EAG will be on that panel alongside with staff and members of the community advisory group. And so that event is happening this Friday from 5:30 to 7 p.m. It'll be live streamed on YouTube as well as on Facebook. And just wanted to make sure that you all got a verbal invitation as well as the email invitation that you got last week from Jake. And I'm more than happy to answer any questions about that program, but just wanted to give you that verbal invitation.
How can the public, should they wish to attend? Am I right that it's 40 seats?
Yeah, so we have 40 seats reserved in the Zoom room itself for people to ask questions during the event. Please keep in mind that the 40 Zoom seats are going to give first priority to members of the community who identify as Black, because this event is for Black History Month and about the Black community. So I want to make sure we keep that centered. And members of the public can also submit questions in advance to the info@interstatebridge.org email address. And they can also watch live on YouTube, and they can send questions post the event as well. And then our staff will try to make sure that those questions get answered. It is a limited amount of time that we have in that room. And so we want to make sure we get some questions answered, at least live that we can, and then get to the others via email for those that we couldn't get to in that time.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other questions for Salome? Okay, great. All right, so we are moving towards our wrap up. What are 3 takeaways from today? So 3 takeaways from our time together, things that you're sitting with, questions you may have.
Dr. Hunt, this is Matt.
Great.
I would just like to really thank everybody for the conversation tonight, but also to encourage us to kind of move beyond our conversation tonight. We talked about how these choices can impact the the BIPOC and the low income communities. So I encourage everyone just to also think about how this affects other communities. Just a bit of a kind of feedback from one of the community engagement sessions was, a lot of these projected times that we're talking about tonight don't take into account the time it takes for a senior or someone with a disability or a mobility constraint to navigate to these different stops and these different stations. And so while we look at these numbers, and I also want us to think about the context of disability and seniors, and also how those intersect with low income and BIPOC communities as well. So I just want us to really dive into those thoughts too.
Thank you. Thank you. Great. Two other takeaways. Meg.
One of the big pieces for me for our discussion tonight was how important it is that whichever transit mode we choose or whichever one goes forward, they all have to work in tandem. They can't really be separate because more than anything, this bridge needs to connect two spaces and they need to have equal access to all kinds of transit, not just cars. So we need to make sure that whichever one we choose, they all work together on both sides of the river. We have to make sure that that's a priority for us. There's connectivity there.
Thank you. Thank you. One more. Well, I want to say thank you to you all for the robust engagement. I really appreciate your questions and the seeking to clarify. The more we question, the more we seek to clarify, the more we generate shared understanding. So I very much appreciate that. Appreciate your presence, Audrey and Kelly. So our meeting evaluation poll should be coming up. And do we have a closing slide, Jake?
Well, it has the date of our next meeting, but that is something that actually, since we've got some time, would be worth bringing up. So we have it normally scheduled for March 21st. That is both spring break, at least for, I know it is for PPS, I imagine it is for other school districts. It also is after the March executive steering group meeting on March 17th. One option would be that I would propose is pushing it a week earlier to March 14th, and wanted to get folks reactions to that, see if that would be a big barrier to being able to attend. So I know we want to be able to provide, have the conversations we need and provide what we can to that executive steering group, because it's informative for their thinking as they make their recommendations to the program. So any thoughts, issues?
So Lily gives a thumbs up and Meg gives a hand motion, a thumbs up. Okay. Okay. All right, so the proposal is move us to March 14th, Monday, March 14th, usual time.
And if that's a barrier to anyone, please let me know. I don't want to do this at the expense of folks' availability, but also want to make sure we can inform the decisions.
Great, so I think we're saying yes.
Cool.
Good deal. Good deal. So our next meeting is Monday, March 14th at 5:30 p.m. 5:30 to 7:30, and we will be talking about Hayden Island, marine drive design options, river crossing design options, and performance measures, and also carry over what elements of today we need to, as we went longer in some areas. April 18th is our April meeting, 5:30 to 7:30. And great. So I would like to say thank you, everyone, for your participation. Thank you for your questions. Please remember, if you have other questions that you would like answered, please share those with the IBR team. And I hear Matt's call for a more nuanced intersectionality that is centering both BIPOC race, right, and race and, right, which is the work. So thank you, Matt. All right.
Dr.
So,
Hunt?
yeah.
If I could take just a moment of privilege, I want to thank our team. And it's not just the IBR team, it is our partners who have been diving into data over the last number of months, running models to get us where we are today, to answer some of the questions that we're going to be answering in the upcoming months. So a lot of this is very, very complicated technical work. We cannot put every alternative on the table. And I heard some great comments from the EAG about some things that may be missing in the analysis. And I can guarantee you that our team has thought about it and our partners have thought about it. But we will provide answers to you guys for things that you think are not included and why they may not be included. So I just want to acknowledge the hard work that has gone into this by the team and the partners.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. All right. So good night. Gratitude, appreciation, and good night.
Thank you, everybody.